Welcome back to Data Science for Everyone. I'm Professor Jones-Rooy. We have come to one of the most important topics that we're going to be covering in this unit and ever. And I think it's the area of data science that is most overlooked and most important. There, I said it, and I'll stand by it. So we're going to be talking about measurement. Specifically, measurement is how we turn the world into data. I'll give you a quick overview. We'll talk about step 1 in measurement, conceptualization, and step 2, operationalization. There's a step 3, validation, and we won't spend as much time on it, but it's also in there. All right. So we love measurement. That's the number one thing I want you to take away from this. And it's absolutely one of the best ways to get involved in data science, even if, or especially if, programming and stats are not your favorite whole thing. If you have lots of subject matter expertise and you want to get connected to data science, measurement is the way in. I'm telling you, it is, and we need you. So reminder, if you saw my earlier videos, you remember this image from Drew Conway. Thank you, Drew, where we said data science is at the intersection of programming, math, and subject matter expertise. We are going to live in the subject matter expertise space right now for reasons we'll see in mere moments. To just unpack a handful of words, we think of data too often as the same thing as the truth. We think of science as, in the phrase data science, to be like only there to sound fancy, because saying I do data doesn't feel like quite right, but data science, okay? Too many of us think that data can speak for itself, and way too many think that science is about being correct. None of those things are true. Data is not the capital T truth. We are here as scientists because we are following the scientific method and we are being transparent and rigorous as we go. It's not just a word to sound fancy. Data absolutely cannot speak for itself. We say things about data that we decided to collect in the way we decided to collect it, including how we measured it, which we're about to talk about. And science is about finding out why we are wrong. If you go to science saying, I need to prove to myself that I'm right, you're not doing science. If you go to science and say, someone help me understand what I'm missing, how can my understanding of the world be improved? Now we're trending towards science. So data does not equal truth. Why not? Well, it's a momentary snapshot at a particular time, at a particular place. Data, if I go around and say, what's the temperature in all the different neighborhoods in New York City? I've collected it at that particular place and that particular moment. That data will change tomorrow or the next day or the next day. If I say, hey, do you approve of the job the president is doing? It's a snapshot of what those people think at those particular moments. We hope that our data taken now can help us understand or predict the future, but there's no guarantee. It could be totally different tomorrow. So it's just a picture. It's just a picture of the world at a time and a place. It's also, and people will get worked up when I talk about this, but it's so important that we acknowledge this so that we can adjust our inferences and learn more about the world. This is not about saying, oh, we don't trust the data because we just don't like it or don't agree with the conclusions. This is about saying, what are the limitations of my data and how can I be mindful of those as I construct my research and draw conclusions from that data so I can make more accurate explanations and predictions. So data is a subjective approximation of the world that we hope to understand. So we, the humans, have decided what's worth measuring. We have data on things because we think it's worth measuring those things. And we don't have data on other things because we think it's not worth measuring those things. And maybe we think it's worth it, but there's no money in it. Maybe we think it's worth it, but it's too hard. Usually all of those are related. It's also subjective because we are going to measure it in a certain way. One of the first videos, I think it was video 2 in this course, we talked about how we might go about understanding what causes some countries to be wealthier than others. One, I've decided to focus on what makes a country wealthy. So that's reflecting my own values in wealth. That's worth measuring. And how I measure wealth, whether it's GDP or an overall feeling of financial security, focusing on one or the other is also subjective. I want the gross domestic product, or when I say wealth, I actually mean whether or not people feel at ease when they think about their finances. Very, very, very different things. Many other ways we could measure it. This is not to say the truth is not out there. When I put this up for my students, I have to get very depressed because most of them don't know what I'm referring to. So please drop in the comments, what show am I referencing? Oh, God. I once offered students an instant A for the course if they could name it without Googling. I couldn't prove that they didn't Google, so it didn't happen. The truth is out there. There is a reality out there. I'm sitting at my computer in outer space. You are at a computer. There's a wall. There's coffee in the world. We have horses. I don't, but horses are out there, right? There's a level of heat in the air. I'm turning it into data with an instrument, a thermometer. There's a table that I'm sitting at. I'm turning it into data. How big is the table? Well, I'm going to do height by width. I could do volume or perimeter or something else if I wanted to. And there's data out there about what I think about a political leader. There are values and beliefs and levels of happiness that I have, and people are turning that into data through, for example, the instrument of a survey. All right. So measurement is what we're doing when we're turning the world into data. We use an instrument, but we say, I'm going to record this aspect of the world and not that aspect. If I want to say, what's the weather like outside? I typically am asking, what's the temperature, as opposed to what's the barometric pressure? Though I think it's linked to my migraine, so I do check barometric pressure more. What's the humidity? What's the wind speed? Right? We choose what aspect of what's it like outside to focus on. So, okay. So the art and science of turning the world into data. So important, so overlooked. So the truth is out there. We're looking at data sets and we're using measurement to get that truth into a data set, knowing it's partial, it's a snapshot, it's momentary, and it's subjective. We're trying our best to be objective, but even writing it down is a reflection of what we think is important. So only some truth ends up as data. What is in that sum? Here are the big points. So humans decide whether and how to study something. We inject normative ideas, subjectivity, and biases in that data. There is always the possibility of errors as well. We just wrote down the number wrong or something else happened. This is not to say, I always have to say this with my students, this is not to say we get to throw away data that we don't like. One of the things that's really frustrating is I post videos sometimes of data sets that I like on social media. And sometimes people will comment, oh, that data is biased. It may well be. It probably is. Most, if not all, data is biased in some way. But you have to say biased how? Biased in what direction? What do you think we're missing? What do you object to in how it was measured? We have to say, you can't say, just like if you're evaluating a study, I don't agree with your study. What is it about the study? Is it the hypotheses? Is it the quality of the data? Is it the model that you chose? Is it the type of analysis? What is it that you are finding to be limiting? And what are the effects of that limitation on the inferences that we're drawing? 2 steps in measurement. I say, wow, there's something I care about in the world. I would love to turn it into data. Or I say, hey, I've got a data set in front of me. Is this data set reflective of the world that I care about? Well, how was it measured? How was it conceptualized? How was it operationalized? Do I think that feels about right? Validation, does it actually capture things that I think would fall under those categories? Okay, so let's be more concrete here. So conceptualization, what do you mean by the thing you're interested in? This is a very philosophical step. It's very common for my students to struggle with the distinction between these two. So I'm going to say this a bunch of different ways. What do you mean by the thing you're interested in? What aspect will you measure relative to the whole broad thing you care about? Has mental health in Gen Z gotten worse over the last 10 years? What do you mean by mental health? Will you measure days that you feel sad? Will you measure incidences of formal diagnoses? Will you measure something other than sad, maybe anxious? Will you measure mental health sick days? Will you measure trips to therapists? Will you measure consumption of drugs to help mental health? All of those are imperfect. I'm sure as I said them, you thought of like, well, that wouldn't be quite right. But there are lots of different ways. All measures are imperfect. All right. So it's a philosophical exercise. Operationalization is how we're going to operate on that concept. How are you going to turn that thing into data? How are you going to turn it into a number or a word or whatever, right? How will you specifically count and record this concept of interest? So I say, oh, I want to study mental health issues. And I'm going to say, how much do people feel sad? How am I going to measure whether someone feels sad? Well, am I going to do a survey? Am I going to measure the use of words that indicate a sad emotion on social media? Am I going to measure how many people are frowning when they're walking around outside? It's tough, right? It's very tough. And of course, again, sadness is not the only type of mental health. So we have to be narrow in our studies in order to do anything. That's good life advice. I tend to be like, I got to do everything. And then you don't do anything. Just be very, 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 very specific. And then you can learn something. Remember that, Andrea. All right. So operationalization is practical. So philosophical step, conceptualization. Practical step, operationalization. Let's do an example. I come from the field of political science. That's what my PhD is in. And so I spend a lot of time, and frankly, one of the reasons I love measurement so much is that political science is a fabulous field to go into if you care about these abstract, multidimensional, hard to pin down things like democracy, fairness, justice, equality, prosperity, trust in government. There's all this interesting stuff out there that we'd love to measure about humans, and thinking about how we might turn that kind of lofty stuff into numbers in a table, I think is so interesting. So one great example that's been studied for many, many years is democracy. There's a lot of research out there on what makes countries more democratic, how democratic countries are. Are we becoming less democratic? So, can we predict whether a country will democratize? What are the relationships between being a democracy and other things we might care about? Wealth, health, etc. Is the world becoming more democratic or less democratic? In order to answer any of those questions, we need data on how democratic a country is. Now, already we're injecting some biases, some serious biases in here. A lot of the research, at least the research I'm familiar with in political science, comes from United States based or American political scientists. And in the United States or Western Europe. And generally speaking, we have all grown up with the narrative that democracy is good and we should want more democracy in the world. So many of these research studies, even though they're not explicitly, we need more democracy in the world, stating that, the very act of saying, what makes a country democratic? What is democracy associated with? Shows that we're interested in democracy and we think there might be something good about it and therefore we should study it. It's very subtle in many cases and we do our best as researchers to be objective, but the very interest in this reveals that we are pretty convinced that democracy might be good or we wouldn't be doing the study in the first place. It's not a criticism, it's an acknowledgement that any study reflects our values. So we need to measure democracy. Or we need to say, are the existing measures out there any good? Now, we could talk about this for years, but I'll give you a high level set of ideas about how it's been conceptualized. So if we were in class, I'd say, what do we mean by democracy? And we'd all raise our hands and probably someone would say elections. The fact that I put a picture of people voting, I wish our ballots were that big, then we'd probably all be a little bit more interested. Who are these tiny people? All right. Elections is most common when I ask students, what do you think of when you think of democracy? But maybe we need to be more specific. Maybe we actually mean free and fair elections. But maybe we don't mean elections. Maybe we mean it's a freedom of speech. Maybe it's a freedom of assembly. It's probably some mix, right? Maybe it's having an independent press. Maybe it's constraints on the executive. So how free is the leader to do what they want, or how much do they have to negotiate for consensus among other leaders? All of these are areas that folks have explored. Plenty of room for more exploration. Different measures of democracy might yield different results. If we want to say, hey, is the world becoming more democratic? We might get different results if we focus on elections versus freedom of speech. Not to say that any of these are particularly easy to measure out of the gates, but these are all different concepts we might use. So which one of those we choose is our conceptualization. I'm talking about democracy. What I mean by democracy is an independent press. That's my conceptualization. What I mean by democracy is free and fair elections. Conceptualization. Many will include more than one conceptualization, but you do need to study each one and be specific. Operationalization. How am I going to turn that thing into a number? So if I conceptualize democracy as regular, free, competitive, and fair elections, generally a very common way to do it, we need to turn each of those components into data. What does regular mean? What does free mean? What is competitive? What is fair, right? We can't just guess at some combination. So we'd have to really start to specify what are the rules for counting these concepts. Okay, regular elections are when a country has 3 in a row, evenly spaced elections. So every 4 years, but they have to have 3. If they just have 2, they're not a democracy. They need to be free. So I could operationalize as some percentage of the population is allowed to vote or maybe actually votes. Competitive. There needs to be more than one candidate running and have a chance at winning. Even that needs to be more specific. And it needs to be fair. Whoever wins the election has to actually take office, and there has to be transparency around that, how that happened. As you might imagine, recent political events in a number of countries, my own included, have made that more complicated. We hopefully will do our best to write down those things. Now, immediately, you will also notice that what happens if we change that definition slightly? What happens if we say, okay, regular elections, you need to have 4? What if you just need to have 2? What if we get rid of the requirement that they're evenly spaced? Political scientists have made careers out of specifically developing measures for democracy where we think through all of these things. A true good study will take many of those different measures and say, oh, okay, which of these seems to best capture democracy, or are our results robust to different measures of democracy? Does it matter if we change the number of elections there need to be, or if we focus on speech versus assembly versus elections? The punchline here is that no measure is ever perfect. We are necessarily turning a hugely complex thing into just a few numbers, right? So A great practice, as I said, is consider multiple operationalizations and conceptualizations of the same phenomenon of interest. So, for example, the previous case was a map of democracies around the world from the Economist Intelligence Unit. You can read all their documentation about how they measure it. This is a map from the Polity 5 project from systemicpeace.org. I really like this particular measure. It's based on executive constraint, among other things. And this is from the Freedom House Index, which focuses on freedom of speech and independent press and safety of journalists around the world. And so you can look up all of those and see which one you find most compelling. But more than that, if you were to say, okay, what causes a country to be more democratic? Democracy is my dependent variable. I would do my whole analysis with the Economist Intelligence Unit as one DV. I would do it again with the Polity data set, and I would do it again with the Freedom House. And then I would say my results are or are not robust to different measures of democracy. That's the ideal world. Often that's not possible, but that's the ideal world. The other thing I want to flag right here, and I thank my students for pointing this out, is that even the way that we've divided up the world is itself subjective. So if you are familiar with some of the politics in certain parts of the world, you may object to where some boundaries are drawn around different entities on this map. I am speaking specifically of Western Sahara and Tibet, but there are certainly others. And one issue here is that not everyone agrees on what counts as a separate country. Very few researchers, I think, would declare, for example, Tibet to be a separate country. But if you actually go into this data set, the word that a lot of these research teams use is entity rather than country. And the idea here is that the researchers decided that these different entities are potentially different enough, or it's worth separating them out for some reason because they operate differently enough from one another, that they are linked as entities rather than as countries. And so even just dividing up the world and deciding what counts in our rows is itself a subjective exercise. And I perfectly accept arguments that even dividing them as entities is not a fair representation of the world. And this is a serious problem. So I know we think of data science as programming, but now here I am talking about geopolitics. That's the depth that we go into when we get into the weeds on measurement. I think it's all super important stuff. So let's recap the key points here because they're subtle. Conceptualization and operationalization are the two big things we want to think about when we start to measure. Conceptualization. I want to study a thing. What do I mean by that thing? The thing we're interested in could be quite broad. Democracy, happiness, quality of horse. Conceptualization means taking that whole wide thing, democracy, and narrowing it into one key dimension. Eventually, we could study more than one dimension, but let's narrow it into one. Engagement at my company, performance of people at my company, level of talent among my, etc. Narrow it down into one. Eventually, you could have multiple. We'd love to study everything fully. I'd love to fully, perfectly study democracy, but we can't. Certainly not in one study. So what do we mean by X? Operationalization. How am I going to turn that concept into data? What's the actual tangible methodology? Literally, you want to think about this as what are the instructions? If I were to assign a research assistant or hire a friend to help me do this research, what would I actually write out for them to do? As you'll read in data dictionaries or code books, conceptualization is usually about a paragraph. Operationalization could go pages. Look for information like, is the data self-reported? Is it a survey? Is it an experiment? Is it from an archive? Was it automated? How did this data get in front of me? How did we collect X? We're going to keep going in the next video on errors in our data set, but every single data set must be evaluated in terms of how it was measured. The final step of validation is, did I actually measure the thing I thought I measured? And we'll talk about that in the next video.